All right, now we're going to talk about the first 2 years of the First World War and some of the major tropes. The general theme here is that no one thought it was going to go on for a long time, and everyone thought they were going to win pretty quickly. And all those assumptions, basically every assumption that every major power went in to the war with, ended up being proven very wrong. A lot of that had to do with the social Darwinistic thinking of the time. They all thought they were powerful, they'd be able to quickly overcome whatever difficulties they had really easily, and none of that played out the way it was supposed to. So the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand brought about what was called the July Crisis, and in it, there were a series of diplomatic machinations that ended up causing all the major European powers to go to war. And the video you watched in Unit 1 explained that, or explained how the interlocking alliances worked. It was kind of a twist of fate that the alliances were set up the way they were at the time. For example, France was actually quite embarrassed to have been in any kind of relationship with Russia, given that France was the country with the most freedom in its democracy, and Russia was the country with the least freedom anywhere in Europe. They didn't have a democracy, had an autocracy controlled by a royal family that could be brutal when they wanted. So that was actually a strange kind of alliance that existed at the time. And there are various reasons, if you study European history, why France and Russia were kind of pushed together, but basically they both feared Germany. The Austro-Hungarians, they had been the ones that were the most upset about the assassination of the Archduke, obviously, and they were really upset that Serbia had been involved, or at least a terrorist organization from Serbia had been involved, and Serbians were pretty happy about it. There are actually rallies in Serbia celebrating the death of the Archduke right after his assassination happened. So Austria-Hungary from the very beginning started planning to punish Serbia for what had occurred. The thinking went among their higher level leadership, if we don't respond in a way that's serious enough, that is strong enough, then we will quickly lose our status more and more. Serbia, but it was a rising country. It had only just fairly recently gained its independence. It was gaining territory through a series of Balkan wars. And this recent action with regard to Austria-Hungary's leadership seemed to threaten to make Serbia even more powerful. And so the leadership of Austria-Hungary couldn't stand for that, and their various subordinate leadership in both the military and the civilian governments started working together to try to plan their response. And a couple of those members of the leadership were in Vienna, where the chief of the army, Count Konrad von Hertzendorf, and the Austro-Hungarian foreign minister Leopold von Berchtold. Also involved was the Hungarian prime minister István Tisza, who was actually trying to calm everyone down to some extent, but even he got wrapped up in the push to make Serbia pay. So after the first couple weeks, there were these high-level discussions for a while, and interestingly, a lot of these didn't really involve the Emperor Franz Joseph at all. He was actually on vacation during a lot of this. I mean, it was summer, and a lot of the royalty was actually on vacation around Europe. So it was a lot of the underlings that were engaging in all this subterfuge. So Conrad, in particular, he and Berchtold wanted to punish Serbia very quickly, but they wanted to get something out of Serbia, but not have to pay too much. So they were very aware that if they went to war with Serbia, that Russia would go to war with Austria-Hungary, and that would be very bad. So if they had to go to war with Russia alone. So they immediately wanted to get the cooperation of Germany. And some telegrams were sent, and they eventually reached Kaiser Wilhelm, who was also upset about the death of the Archduke, or at least unhappy to some extent. And he basically gave a vague reply of do what you think you need to do. And they continued planning to punish Serbia somehow. And later in July, on July 23rd, there was an ultimatum sent to Serbia's government saying, here's 10 things we demand you do, or else we're going to attack you. And a number of those 10 points were reasonable enough. A couple of them were extremely unreasonable that Serbia would never agree to, one of which was requiring the Austrian government to run its own investigation of the Black Hand organization and whether or not there was a connection between it and the Serbian government, and that had to be run by Austrians, not by Serbians. And there were other various points that just demanded that Serbia give up a lot of its sovereignty, and they weren't about to do that. And so Serbia said, no, we're not going to do it. Serbia was in contact with Russia and said, hey, we need help. And Austria had made it clear to them that we're going to attack you, and they also knew they had the backing of Germany. Now, no one else knew that Germany and Austria had this secret understanding, and not even Kaiser Wilhelm probably knew they had this secret understanding. He had just said, yeah, do what you need to do, probably not thinking that much about it, because when it got closer to the outbreak of hostilities, a number of the high leadership tried to walk back what they had done and said, well, maybe we can still work this out diplomatically, but a lot of the mobilization had already gotten underway. And mobilization meant a huge kind of turning of the gears. It meant calling up all of your reserve forces. It meant getting your transportation networks ready to carry war material. It meant implementing these various defense plans or offensive plans that the army had been holding for some time. And so Austria-Hungary started mobilizing later in July, and then there were other understandings going on between other countries. So Russia had an understanding with France, and France made it clear, the French minister in Russia, his name was Paleolog, or the French ambassador in Russia, he made it clear that France was going to support Russia, even though it probably wasn't in France's interest to do this. And that opened up the floodgates in Germany for Germany's war planning that had been in the works for a number of years to go into motion, because this was going to be the two-front war between France and Russia that Germany had been planning for about 10 years. So this image here kind of gives you a sense of the timeline. Basically, there were all these secret understandings. The big ones to remember are the ultimatum to Serbia on the 23rd of July, and then Germany giving them the so-called blank check on in mid-July, then Austria mobilizing, Russia mobilizing, Austria invading Serbia, Russia responding to that, and then Germany mobilizing and declaring war on Russia. Then France mobilized the same day, and that was basically the spring of the mousetrap, so to speak. Britain was the one country that probably didn't have, or had the least interest in getting into the war. Britain didn't really need to get involved, but Britain had understandings both with France and with Belgium, and when Germany decided to invade Belgium, that got Britain involved. Britain wasn't extremely well prepared. It had a much smaller army than either France or Germany, or a smaller army at that point, but it got in anyway. There's speculation that there was a secret plan between some of Britain's civilian leadership and France's for Britain and France to get involved with each other, or ally with each other against Germany. An observer up to this point wouldn't have been 100% sure that Britain would join France against Germany. That Britain and France had been traditional enemies for much of the 19th century. So some Germans didn't think that Britain would get involved. A lot of Europeans weren't sure that this was exactly the way the war was going to proceed, but it did. And by the first week of August, wars had been declared and everything was in motion. For a lot of Europeans, it was this extremely exciting time, a time to party, or well, not party. There was a run on the banks. A lot of people were concerned that commerce was going to get severely disrupted. But there were also these outbursts of excitement, of celebration. One that's famous now is a spontaneous celebration that occurred in Munich, Germany, in which, as far as we know, there was a picture of the crowd. And in the crowd, if you zoomed in on the picture, you could see one young man who was particularly excited and has this expression of just pure anticipation and excitement. And that picture was of Adolf Hitler, which German propaganda in the 1930s would play up as demonstrating how patriotic he was. But according to Hitler's book Mein Kampf, he said that moment was when all the troubles of his youth ended and he decided to become a real man, essentially. And a lot of people felt that way. A lot of Europeans felt that there had been this conflict brewing, and this was the time to see who's going to be the winner. This is the time to answer a lot of unanswered questions about who is going to control what parts of Europe. And a lot of people reacted to the war with a lot of positivity, interestingly enough. Germany was the most prepared to mobilize, and they also had the most in-depth planning.